Most people underestimate the ones who stay quiet, the ones who keep their heads down and just do their jobs. But what happens when you push the wrong person, someone who's lived through nightmares most could never imagine? Let us know in the comments section below. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to prove you weren't as weak as people assumed? Keisha Reynolds wiped down the counter, her hands moving in smooth, practiced motions. The old rag smelled of cheap sanitizer, but she didn't mind. It was just another night at Thompson's liquor store, the same place she'd been working for the past 6 months since she came back home. Nothing special about it. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Shelves stacked high with whiskey, rum, and vodka lining the small aisles. A small TV mounted in the corner played an old western on mute, just something to fill the silence. She liked the quiet. It was a different kind of quiet than the one she knew from Iraq. There, silence was deadly. It meant something was about to happen. Out here, silence was just life. Predictable. The bell above the entrance jingled, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced up, taking in the man who stepped inside. Mid-30s, maybe early 40s. He had the look of someone who had seen better days. Scruffy beard, dark hoodie pulled low over his face, hands stuffed deep in his pockets. Keisha knew that look. She'd seen it before, overseas and right here at home. A man down on his luck, or a man about to do something stupid. She didn't say anything, just watched. He hesitated near the door, eyes flicking around the store, then made his way to the back, pretending to browse. Keisha exhaled slowly. She'd seen guys like him before, men with the weight of the world pressing down on their shoulders. Desperate men, dangerous men. Still, she stayed calm. "Let me know if you need help finding something," she said, voice even. He didn't answer, just kept pretending to look at bottles he probably couldn't afford. She shifted her weight, readying herself without looking like it. It was subtle. The slight bend in her knees, the way her right hand hovered just below the counter. Some habits never died. The front door swung open again, this time letting in an older man, regular customer. Mr. Henry, always coming in for his nightly six-pack. The old man barely glanced at Hoodie Guy before nodding at Keisha. "Evening, young lady," he said, moving toward the fridge section. Keisha nodded back. "Evening, Mr. Henry." Hoodie Guy stiffened slightly at the sound of her voice. She caught that. Something was off. She wasn't about to jump to conclusions, but her gut had been right more times than it was wrong. And right now, her gut told her something was about to go sideways. Mr. Henry hummed to himself as he grabbed his beer and shuffled toward the counter. Hoodie Guy turned away, walking a little too fast, heading toward the exit. Keisha followed him with her eyes, but didn't call him out. If he was going to leave, let him leave. The bell jingled again, and that should have been the end of it. Should have been. But 5 minutes later, as Mr. Henry walked out and the door shut behind him, Hoodie Guy came back in, and this time, he wasn't pretending. The moment the door closed, he pulled the gun. Keisha barely reacted. Not at first. She'd been on the other end of a gun before, too many times to count. But this was different. This wasn't a war zone. This was home. "Open the register," he demanded, voice rough, shaking. His hand trembled as he held the gun. He was nervous. More nervous than she was. Keisha lifted her hands slowly, keeping them where he could see. "You don't want to do this." "Just open it," he shouted, voice cracking. His eyes darted toward the window like he was making sure no one had seen him come back in. Keisha exhaled, steady. "All right, relax." She moved, slow and deliberate, toward the register, but she wasn't thinking about the money. She was thinking about his stance, the way he held the gun, the way his finger twitched near the trigger. He was jittery, scared. He didn't want to be here. She could work with that. "You ever shot that thing before?" she asked, her voice casual. "Shut up and open the damn register." Keisha didn't flinch. She just watched him, her dark eyes locking onto his. He avoided her gaze. Another sign. He wasn't a killer, just a man in too deep. "You ever killed a person?" she asked, her voice softer now. His jaw clenched. "I said shut up." Keisha's fingers hovered over the buttons, but she didn't press them. "I have," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "4 tours in Iraq. I've had guns pointed at me more times than I can count. So, if you're gonna shoot, you better do it now." Hoodie guy's breath hitched. The gun wavered. She took a step closer. Just one. Enough to make him realize that he was the one in trouble. "Because if you don't pull that trigger right now," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "I promise you, you won't get another chance." His hands shook harder now. "You're bluffing," he muttered, but his voice had lost its edge. Keisha held his gaze. "Try me." Silence stretched between them. Then, the gun clattered to the floor. His shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him all at once. His breathing was ragged, eyes wide, lost. He looked like a man drowning. Keisha reached down, picked up the gun, and popped the magazine out with smooth precision. She slid the empty weapon across the counter, away from both of them. He collapsed onto his knees. "I didn't want to. I just—" His voice cracked, and suddenly he was just a man again, not a threat, just broken. Keisha sighed, rubbing her temple. "Yeah," she muttered. "I know." The sound of sirens wailed in the distance. Someone had called the cops. Probably Mr. Henry. Hoodie guy flinched, his breathing turning erratic. Keisha crouched down in front of him. "You got a name?" He hesitated before swallowing hard. "Marcus." "All right, Marcus," she said, exhaling. "Cops are coming. You want to walk out of here, or you want to make it worse?" He let out a shaky breath, then nodded. I don't know what to do." Keisha stood up, nodding toward the counter. "Turn yourself in. Try to fix it. That's the only choice that matters now." Marcus closed his eyes, then nodded. As the red and blue lights flashed outside, Keisha exhaled. Just another night. Another fight. But this time, nobody had to die. Keisha leaned against the counter, arms crossed as she watched the cops cuff Marcus and haul him outside. He didn't resist, didn't even speak, just walked like a man carrying the weight of his own mistakes, too tired to fight against them anymore. The store was quiet now, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional static crackle from the officer's radio. The same cop who had asked her to give a statement, a stocky white guy with tired eyes and a thick mustache, turned back to her, notebook in hand. "You okay?" Keisha nodded. "Yeah." The cop exhaled through his nose, glancing toward the door where Marcus had just been taken. "We ran his record, no priors. Looks like he just got desperate. Still, armed robbery's a serious charge." Keisha didn't respond to that. She just looked past him, through the window where the squad car was parked, Marcus sitting in the back, his head down. She could still see the way his hands shook, the sweat dripping down his forehead, the fear in his eyes that had nothing to do with her. Desperation could make a man do dangerous things. The cop cleared his throat. "If you remember anything else, call us." He tucked his notepad away, hesitated, then said, "You ever think about carrying?" Keisha raised an eyebrow. "Carrying?" "A gun," he clarified. "Liquor stores get hit all the time. You handled yourself well, but next time, guy might not be so easy to talk down." She let out a slow breath, tilting her head slightly. "I don't need a gun." The officer studied her for a second before nodding once. "All right. Your call." With that, he left, pushing through the glass door and stepping into the cold night. Keisha didn't move for a long moment. She just listened to the faint echo of sirens fading into the distance, to the hum of the store, to the pulse in her own ears. Then, finally, she reached under the counter and pulled out the unopened pack of cigarettes she kept hidden there. She wasn't supposed to smoke in the store. Didn't even like the taste. but old habits were hard to kill, and right now she needed something to keep her hands busy. She stepped outside, leaning against the brick wall just beside the door, and lit one up. The first inhale burned. It had been years since she smoked regularly, back when she was overseas, when the only way to kill time between missions was a cigarette and silence. The memories came back fast. Gunfire, sand, the thick smell of sweat and burnt metal, the way her heartbeat had slowed every time she squeezed the trigger. She closed her eyes, exhaled slow. She didn't miss that life. But she couldn't escape it either. Rough night. Keisha opened her eyes to see Mr. Henry standing a few feet away, leaning against his truck. He hadn't left after all. He was watching her the way old men watched the young, half curious, half knowing. She took another drag, then smirked. Something like that. Mr. Henry rubbed his chin. You know, I've been coming to this store since before you were born. Seen it change hands 3 times. Never seen a cashier handle a stick-up like that before. Keisha let out a quiet laugh. Yeah, well, I'm not like most cashiers. That's obvious. He took a step closer, hands in his pockets, his expression thoughtful. You served, didn't you? Keisha blinked. Most people didn't guess. She didn't advertise it. Yeah, she said finally. 4 tours. Mr. Henry let out a low whistle. Hell of a thing. She didn't say anything to that. Army? He guessed. Marines. His lips pressed together in understanding. Knew it. You had that look about you. She raised an eyebrow. That right? He nodded. Ain't just the way you carry yourself. It's the eyes. I've seen it before. My brother came back from Nam with that same look. Keisha turned her head slightly, studying him now. He didn't talk like most old-timers who brought up Vietnam. There was no pity in his voice, no forced gratitude, just recognition. She flicked the cigarette away, exhaling smoke. That why you didn't leave? Mr. Henry shrugged. Maybe. Keisha hummed, looking out toward the empty street. After a beat, he said, You ever talk to someone about it? She frowned slightly. About what? What happened over there? She glanced at him. He wasn't prying, wasn't pushing, just asking. She licked her lips, shaking her head. Nah, not really. I know it. Keisha let out a dry chuckle. What's there to talk about? Mr. Henry didn't respond right away. Then he said, Sometimes you don't know until you start talking. She scoffed, but didn't argue. Silence stretched between them for a while. Then Mr. Henry pushed off his truck and nodded toward the store. You need anything, you know where to find me. She smirked. Thanks, old man. He chuckled. Be safe, girl. With that, he climbed into his truck and drove off, taillights disappearing down the road. Keisha stood there a little longer, watching until the street was empty again. Then, finally, she turned back inside. The store was quiet. She walked behind the counter, grabbed the broom, and started sweeping. Routine. That was what she needed. Normalcy. At least, that's what she told herself. But deep down, she knew the truth. Tonight had stirred something in her. Something she thought she had buried a long time ago. And no amount of sweeping was going to make it disappear. Keisha was halfway through counting the register when she heard the knock on the glass door. It was late, too late for customers. The neon open sign was still on, but the lights outside had dimmed, making the reflection in the glass blur with the streetlights. She lifted her head, her body tense before her mind had even processed why. 2 men stood outside. One short, stocky, and nervous-looking, the other tall, lanky, with a face that had seen too many bad choices. Keisha didn't move right away. Her fingers rested lightly against the counter, close to the silent alarm under the register. She had seen men like these before. In alleys, in bars where too much money changed hands, and back when she was deployed, standing in villages where desperation was just as deadly as a loaded weapon. The stocky one knocked again, glancing around, shifting on his feet like he wasn't sure if they should be here. The tall one just stood there, staring straight through the glass at her. Keisha exhaled slowly, pushing the register shut. She moved toward the door, her boots barely making a sound on the linoleum. She could tell the tall one recognized something in her, too. Something that made him hesitate before trying to intimidate her. She unlocked the door, but didn't step aside. "Store's about to close." The tall one tilted his head slightly. "We ain't here to buy anything." She kept her stance even. "Then you can turn around and walk out the way you came." The stocky one shifted again. "Look, we just want to talk." Keisha glanced between them. They weren't armed, at least not openly. But that didn't mean they weren't dangerous. Talk about what? Muckus? She felt her stomach tighten slightly. So that's what this was about. Keisha leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "What about him?" The tall one ran his tongue over his teeth. "You see, Marcus, he owed people that ain't too happy with him getting locked up before he could settle those debts." Keisha didn't blink. "That's got nothing to do with me." "See, that's the thing," the stocky one muttered, glancing back toward the street. "Word is, you're the reason he got caught. He was supposed to walk out of here with cash in hand, and instead, he walked out in cuffs." Keisha tilted her head. "He walked out because he made a choice. He put the gun down." The tall one's eyes darkened. "Because you made him." Keisha let out a small breath, eyes flicking toward the parking lot. Empty. No cops. No customers. Just her. And them. The tall one leaned in slightly. "Now, see, that don't sit right with us. When a man like Marcus owes money, it don't just disappear, 'cause he gets himself locked up. Somebody's gotta pay it." Keisha's expression didn't change. "Not my problem." The stocky one's hand twitched at his side. "Maybe it should be." Keisha finally smiled. A slow, almost amused kind of smile. The kind that made both men hesitate, if only for a second. "See, now that's where you messed up," she murmured. The tall one narrowed his eyes. "Ah, yeah?" Keisha's gaze sharpened. She took a step forward, forcing them both to shift back, their confidence cracking just slightly. "I've been on the other side of a shakedown before," she continued, her voice even. "I've been threatened by better men than you. I've had guns pointed at me by people who weren't scared to pull the trigger. You're just out here talking." The stocky one stiffened. "Lady, you don't want to—" "Don't I?" The words were soft, almost too quiet. The tall one swallowed. Keisha took another step. "You came here looking for a weak spot," she continued. "But I'm not Marcus. I don't scare easy. You think leaning on me is going to get you paid? You think threatening me is going to get you what you want?" Neither of them spoke. Keisha exhaled through her nose. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, her voice dropping to something cold. "You're going to turn around, walk out, and tell whoever sent you that Marcus is their problem now. You try to put me in the middle of this again, and I promise you—" She stepped even closer, lowering her voice until the air between them was heavy with it. "You will regret it." The stocky one's breathing was uneven now, his hands clenched at his sides. The tall one grabbed his shoulder. "Enough." His eyes never left Keisha's, but he wasn't pushing anymore. He saw it now. He saw the line, and he wasn't ready to cross it. The stocky one hesitated, then exhaled sharply, shoving his hands into his pockets. Keisha didn't step back until they did, until the distance was clear, until they were out the door. The tall one paused at the threshold, glancing at her one last time. "This ain't over." Keisha smirked. "It is for you." And then she shut the door, locked it, watched them walk away. They wouldn't come back. They weren't ready for that kind of fight. But that didn't mean this was over. Keisha turned, her pulse still steady, her breath still even. She had been right about one thing. Some battles never ended. They just changed shape. And tonight, she'd won another one. For now, Keisha sat in the break room long after the store had closed, her back against the wall, staring at the ceiling. The hum of the cooler filled the silence, a steady, rhythmic sound that might have been soothing if her mind weren't still racing. She had been in a lot of fights before, some where she saw the enemy coming, some where she didn't. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was home. And yet the battle had followed her anyway. She ran a hand over her face, exhaling slow. The adrenaline was gone now, leaving only the weight behind. The weight of knowing it would never be over, not really. There would always be another fight waiting around the corner. She had walked away from war, but war hadn't walked away from her. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. She reached for it, glancing at the screen. A text from an unknown number. "We're not done." Keisha stared at the message for a long moment before tossing the phone back onto the table. She wasn't surprised. They would push again. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually, because that was how it worked. Predators always tested their prey. But she wasn't prey. She stood, grabbing her jacket off the chair, slipping it on with practiced ease. She was tired, but not beaten. Not by a long shot. She left through the back door, locking it behind her, stepping out into the cool night. The air smelled like rain, thick and heavy, the kind that threatened a storm but never quite delivered. Her boots echoed against the pavement as she walked toward her truck, her senses still on high alert. Years of training, years of surviving. It never turned off. She climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and just sat there for a moment, staring at her own reflection in the rearview mirror. The same face she had seen every day since she came back. The same face that still looked for threats in every shadow. The same face that still expected an attack. She smirked, shaking her head. Some things never changed. She pulled out of the lot, heading toward the only place that made sense. 15 minutes later, she pulled up in front of a small, dimly lit bar on the edge of town. The kind of place where nobody asked questions, where the jukebox was always playing something slow and sad, and where people drank to forget. She wasn't here to forget. She was here to remember who she was. Inside, the air smelled like old wood and cheap whiskey. A few regulars sat at the bar, nursing drinks lost in their own ghosts. Keisha walked to the counter, nodding at the bartender, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a cigarette dangling from her lips. "Rough night?" the bartender asked, pouring without being asked. Keisha took the glass, smirking slightly. "Something like that." The bartender leaned against the counter. "You look like you got something on your mind." Keisha studied her drink. "I got people making stupid decisions and thinking I'm the one to pay for them." The bartender nodded knowingly. "Yeah, that happens." Keisha lifted the glass, took a slow sip. The warmth settled in her chest, but it didn't burn the way she wanted it to. She set the glass down, rolling it between her fingers. "You ever feel like no matter how far you go, you're still standing in the same place?" The bartender exhaled smoke, watching her. "Every damn day." Keisha let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. She had left the battlefield, but the battlefield never really left her. It wasn't about the guns. It wasn't about the enemies. It was about the fight. It had always been about the fight, and she was tired of fighting alone. She pulled her phone from her pocket, staring at the message again. Then, slowly, she typed her own. "You want a war? You picked the wrong one." She hit send. The bartender raised an eyebrow. "That wise?" Keisha smirked. "Probably not." She finished her drink, set the empty glass down, and stood. Outside, the night stretched wide and open, full of all the things that waited in the dark. She wasn't afraid of the dark. She had lived in it too long to fear it now. She climbed into her truck, gripping the steering wheel, feeling the weight settle again. The weight of knowing the fight wasn't over. The weight of knowing it never would be. She exhaled, rolling her shoulders. Then she put the truck in drive and let the war come to her.